At the start of 2020, I was on the Venezuelan and Colombian border working on a documentary about the refugee crisis when the pandemic hit. Suddenly, I found myself returning home to Australia, only to step into a nation that was literally on fire. The entire East Coast was burning. They called it a 1-in-1,000-year event, but in the years since, we've had 3 catastrophic floods, one just last month. Each one unprecedented, each one record-breaking, each one a 1-in-1,000-year disaster. But this isn't just my country's story. What's happening in Australia is happening everywhere. Homes collapsing into the sea on America's east coast, devastating fires in Greece, Canada, Los Angeles, historic floods in Spain, Libya, Nigeria, entire Pacific nations threatened due to rising sea levels. The list goes on. This is our reality now, not the exception, the norm. So the question isn't, is this happening? It's what do we do about it? That's why I was so drawn to this issue, because in the face of these disasters and these urgent calls to cut emissions, both as individuals and as nations, there's a vast sector of society not just dragging its feet, but actively hiding its contribution to the crisis, the military. It feels ironic because these are the very institutions that were among the first to recognize climate change as a serious threat. And yet, when it came to reducing their own emissions, they had carved out a loophole. This documentary began as a way to explore that contradiction, to understand how institutions that exist to protect us could be contributing so heavily to a threat that endangers us all, and how, over time, the system designed to hold them accountable had been quietly dismantled or ignored. It started with the Kyoto Protocol, the world's first legally binding climate treaty. During negotiations, the United States demanded that all the military emissions be excluded. There was some pushback, so a compromise was reached. Reporting would be voluntary. And as you might guess, very few volunteered. And now, decades later, we find ourselves in a situation where the global military sector is responsible for around 6% of the world's total emissions. That's more than the entire country of Russia. But here's what really surprised me. War itself is just one part of the picture. Military emissions begin long before the first shots are fired. The building of bases, the constant movement of troops and equipment, the operation of entire logistical networks, it all consumes staggering amounts of fuel. Transport alone accounts for about half of military emissions. To give just one example, fueling a single Abrams tank for a day uses as much fuel as a small car would in a year, and there are 10,000 of them currently in service. Or consider the fact that the United States operates over 750 military bases across the globe, none of which give any consideration to emissions. Then, of course, there's the fighting itself. War accelerates environmental destruction. During the Vietnam War, the use of Agent Orange destroyed over 3 million hectares of forest, about 18% of the country's tree cover. The War on Terror is estimated to have released 1.2 billion tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And when the fighting stops, the emissions don't. Rebuilding can be just as polluting. The war in Gaza, for example, has left the region in ruins. Early estimates suggest that reconstruction alone could generate over 60 billion tons of CO2, mostly from the concrete needed to rebuild what's been lost. So what can we do? The first step is simple and long overdue. Military emissions must be measured, tracked, and made public, because we can't change what we don't know about. The next step is to reduce those emissions, not by disarming, but by rethinking the way militaries operate. This isn't about weakening national security, it's about strengthening it in a way that doesn't come off at the cost of planetary security. We need militaries that run on clean energy, not fossil fuels. We need defense forces that protect not just borders, but futures. And more than anything, we need fewer wars, less conflict, more diplomacy, and more peace. Thank you, Chandra.
Joel, thank you so much. So well said. I was taken by some of the key points you made, and I'll just ask you one thing about the systemic dismantling of the attempts to put together an accountability and reporting mechanism. How long has that been going on, and how, and you gave some examples, But is
Well,
that still
it
very
really
active?
began as soon as the world started taking notice and counting emissions with the Kyoto Protocol. And the United States was at the forefront of repressing emissions counting and has done ever since. Some, very few, generally countries with smaller militaries do report on their emissions, but they're inconsequential as compared with the bigger militaries in the world, China, the US, Russia, India. Really, and since the Kyoto Protocol, which was really the start of emissions counting or the global stocktake, they've been excluded.
Thank you, Joel. And thank you for making also the point that the military emissions is not just during the war, and giving us some numbers about how the logistics and mobilization phase and the constant preparedness for war is such a huge contributor. And also that very important point you made that the emissions don't stop when the fighting stops.
Exactly.
And it goes on, and there's asbestos and groundwater contamination, all of those things that related to emissions, but also related to all sorts of other environmental degradation.